Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to 20th Century Revolutions. Episode 2.26, The Sultan Strikes Back. This episode is brought to you by Patreon subscriber Kernandad. Thank you so much for your generous pledge. All of your support really does help keep this series chugging along. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your support. So, a few quick pronunciation corrections. Thank you again to Sinan for pointing these out. First is Turkish feminist Halide Edip. I said Halid, which I think is actually a male name, so sorry about that. It is Halide Edip. And then the one that is going to be consistently tough is sociologist and ideologue of Turkish nationalism, Ziya Gökalp. There's a silent R in there. I'm not even sure what I said last time, but it's a tough one, and he is super important. So I'm just going to have to struggle through it. Ziya Gökalp. Thank you again to Sinan. All right, so over the past 2 episodes, we have been working through the months directly following the Young Turk Revolution of July 1908 and tracing the events that directly and indirectly resulted from the CUP's mutiny in the Ottoman Balkans and the subsequent reinstatement of constitutional rule in the Ottoman Empire. Throughout the fall and winter of 1908, 2 parallel and somewhat contradictory developments would define post-revolutionary life, with one track happening domestically within the newly liberalized Ottoman society, and the other internationally amongst the great powers of Europe and the Balkan nation-states. To begin with the domestic front, as we talked about 2 episodes back, the Young Turk Revolution had initiated a wave of optimism and euphoria, as Ottoman society suddenly woke up from its 30-year stupor under the despotic regime of Sultan Abdulhamid. And as people emerged from this stagnant slumber, large demonstrations broke out in towns and cities across the empire, as people from all walks of life, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, men and women, young and old, came out to celebrate the dawning of a new age that everyone hoped would be defined by openness, cosmopolitanism, justice, camaraderie, liberty, and peace. And within this newly liberal environment, people joined in on the new political life of the empire by starting up newspapers, magazines, and journals, or by forming political parties, social clubs, and labor unions. And the big event that everyone was getting ready for was the November election, in which the Ottoman people would choose members of parliament to represent them in the constitutional government. But as the Ottoman public enjoyed their new freedoms and geared up for parliamentary politics, larger developments happening outside of the empire would begin to steer the ongoing revolutionary project in a new direction. As we saw last week, the European imperialists and the Balkan nationalists simply could not resist what they saw as a golden opportunity to press their advantage in Ottoman Europe. And in one shockingly quick succession, the Bulgarians declared independence from the Ottoman Empire on October 4th. Then a day later, Austria-Hungary officially annexed Ottoman Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then the real cherry on top came when Greeks in Ottoman Crete declared union or enosis with the Kingdom of Greece. The primary identity of the CUP as a revolutionary party was that of saviors and protectors of the fatherland. And many patriotic Ottomans assumed that once in power, the CUP would begin to reassert control over territories that had been lost to the twin forces of European imperialism and Balkan nationalism. So even though Bulgaria, Bosnia, and Crete were only nominally Ottoman provinces at this point, the CUP and their followers hoped to change this state of affairs, and Unionists planned to use the popularity of the new constitutional regime to reassert control over their peripheral territories of the empire. So the Bosnian annexation, together with Bulgarian independence and Crete's union with Greece, would begin to tarnish the CUP's reputation amongst patriotic Ottomans, especially amongst more conservative Muslims who already resented the way in which the CUP had challenged the authority of their Sultan Caliph. This dramatic loss of territory happened just months after the CUP's mutiny in the Balkans. And so, fairly quickly, the CUP would begin to face that classic dilemma that all revolutionary parties must eventually face after they have overthrown an autocratic regime. And that dilemma is figuring out how to deal with the opposition. Because when people used to speak out against Sultan Abdul Hamid, he would just censor their publications or offer suggestions that it might be a good idea to head on over to Paris if they knew what was best for them. But one of the primary accomplishments of the CUP's revolution was that it lifted press censorship and allowed for the free creation of political parties. At first, most of these new publications and parties espoused liberalism, constitutionalism, and unionism and hailed the revolutionary officers in the Third Army as heroes of liberty. But then, as the empire began to lose yet more territory, and as people began to learn more about the CUP's plan to secularize and centralize the government, opposition to the CUP would grow fairly rapidly. And this opposition would come from many different angles. From liberals opposed to the CUP's centralization policies to reactionary conservatives denouncing the CUP's turn towards secularism and modernism and away from religion and tradition. The climax of today's episode will be the counter-revolutionary events surrounding the so-called 31 March incident, in which the reactionary forces of the empire would burst forth onto the scene in very dramatic fashion, with an army counter-mutiny against CUP Mektebli officers, huge demonstrations of religious students and scholars in Istanbul, and the tragic return of mass violence against Armenians. And though the liberal opposition would play a critical role in precipitating the counter-revolution of 1909, the most visible and forceful element in the 31 March incident would be the forces of reactionary conservatism, as conservative soldiers came together with religious students to push for a return to sultanic autocracy and the full reinstatement of Sharia Islamic law. The insurrection of spring 1909 would fundamentally change the revolutionary project of the CUP, as the Unionists would become increasingly paranoid about reactionaries who threatened to undo the revolution at every turn. So, the 31 March incident would forever alter the direction of the revolution in Ottoman lands. And today we will work through exactly how we will get from widespread euphoric partying with everyone in the streets hailing liberal constitutionalism and brotherhood across ethnic lines to crowds in Istanbul calling for the reinstatement of Islamic Sharia law and the mass killing of tens of thousands of Armenians in the city of Adana. The counter-revolution of spring 1909 would arrive shockingly fast, though it was not immediate, and there would be several months in which Ottomans came together to make a sincere effort at making parliamentary government work for everyone. In November and December of 1908, just as news of the Austrian annexation and Bulgarian independence were trickling in, Ottomans began casting votes for their chosen representatives to parliament. People from all across the empire, from Libya in the south up to Kosovo in the north, and from Beirut, Jerusalem, and Damascus in the east on through eastern Anatolia to the Black Sea coast and over to Istanbul, Ottomans from all walks of life made their voices heard in a democratic process for the first time in a really long time. And for many sections of the population, this was to be their entrance into electoral politics, as the CUP had made a few important changes to the 1876 electoral process that the CUP had restored and that had been first designed by Midhat Pasha and the Young Ottomans. One of the biggest of these changes was expanding the electorate so that now all tax-paying males over the age of 25 were eligible to vote. Now, of course, this excluded exactly half the adult population, as women, though newly emerging in the public sphere, would have to continue their struggle for full participation in civic life. But with that said, when compared with the other democratic experiments happening at this same time, The Ottoman election of 1908 was fairly democratic and relatively free, with little in the way of electioneering, intimidation, or other funny business. On election day, votes were collected in gigantic urns, and the submission of these votes was often accompanied by a carnival-like atmosphere in which large, raucous crowds gathered in the streets of towns and cities to, first and foremost, have a big old party, but then also to submit their votes to their local electors. And this election produced a parliament that would more or less represent the constituent parts of the empire. For a quick rundown of the numbers, we'll start with the ethnic composition of parliament, though as we go through this, we always need to keep in mind that, number one, a lot of the delegates would not, and I repeat, not identify strongly with their ethnic groups. And then number two, this sort of data would often lump together groups that we would today understand as separate ethnicities into one single group. So a lot of this sort of data on ethnic groups represents later historians imposing categories that weren't necessarily all that important at the time. But with that said, the parliament ended up being roughly 50% Turkish, 20% Arab, 10% Albanian, 10% Ottoman Greek, 5% Armenian, 3% Slavic, and 2% Jewish. And then it is almost certain that the Kurdish and Bosnian Muslim candidates were counted in the Turkish category. So what this all means is that even though the CUP had insisted that there be no ethnic quotas, as they were hoping to lessen the importance of ethnic identity in the name of Ottoman unity, the elections still produced a parliament that more or less represented all the major ethnic communities of the empire. Then, there were really only a few significant political parties that were organized by the time of the election. And for a quick rundown of the parties, Prince Sabah ad-Din's Liberty Party had 4 official members in parliament, though they would begin to gain supporters amongst the many independents in parliament who opposed the CUP and supported the Liberty Party's platform of decentralization and local autonomy. Then the Dashnaks, aka the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, also had about 4 delegates, and early on the Dashnaks would tend to ally themselves with the CUP. Then there were around 4 members from Macedo-Bulgarian political clubs, and finally there were 2 socialists. And all of this was out of a total of 288 delegates. So what this means is that the CUP had by far the most delegates of any organized party, at around 50 to 60 deputies. So the CUP would claim close to 20% of the parliamentary seats. Then the greatest number of deputies, around 50 to 60%, were independents, whose party loyalty would often shift. And independents would usually either vote with the Unionists in the CUP pushing for centralization, or with Prince Sabah ad-Din and the Liberty Party pushing for decentralization. Now, perhaps the single most interesting aspect of this parliament is the way in which it would serve as an incubator for the future politics of the many different nation-states that would emerge in the post-Ottoman Middle East, Balkans, and Turkey. Because following the 2 great catastrophic upheavals of the Balkan Wars and then World War I, everyone would get thrown in a million different directions, and a lot of the delegates who had served in the Ottoman parliament starting in 1908 would go on to be very important national leaders, and many would even be founding fathers of the future nation-states that would emerge from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. And during a conversation I was having with my friend, fellow amateur historian and lover of Ottoman history, Ben Little, Ben made what I thought was a pretty striking comparison, saying that this parliament essentially had the equivalent of like a dozen George Washingtons and Simón Bolívars all in the same room, discussing Ottoman politics. And this is perhaps what is most striking, that at this time, these future founding fathers of places like Albania, Armenia, Turkey, Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan, Libya, etc., were not doing everything they could to undermine the empire, or even trying to break away and form their own independent countries. quite to the contrary. These future leaders of independent nation-states were all kind of trying to figure out how to make the Ottoman Empire work in the long term, with the overall goal of trying to keep the Ottoman Empire alive. That's why this moment is so fascinating, because it challenges the typical narrative surrounding the late Ottoman Empire as the terminally ill, sick man just waiting to die. The sick man of Europe paradigm was the purview of European imperialists and Balkan irredentists who viewed the Ottoman Empire as a backwards entity doomed to fail and only to be considered inasmuch as it brought up diplomatic headaches over how the spoils of the fallen empire would be split up amongst the imperialistic great powers. But we have to remember that the period immediately following the Young Turk Revolution was a period of initial optimism. And these parliamentary delegates were trying their darndest to strengthen the Ottoman Empire and to prevent the further encroachment of Western imperialism and Balkan irredentist nationalism. All right, so let's just name drop a few of these delegates in case you want to read further into them. First up is our old friend Ismail Kemal, who would go on to be the founding father of the independent state of Albania in 1912, and would act as Albania's very first prime minister. Before Albanian independence, Ismail Kemal was a very influential delegate in the Ottoman parliament, representing the interests of his Albanian constituents from 1908 all the way up until 1912 on the eve of Albanian independence. And then a ton of other Albanian leaders, essentially like all of the future founders of the Albanian nation-state, would serve alongside Kemal in parliament, and these Albanian delegates would often be on opposing sides of a given vote, as Albanian delegates ranged from being hardcore unionists aligned with the CUP to being monarchists loyal to the old Hamidian regime. The group surrounding Ismail Kemal tended to support decentralization and local autonomy, and would therefore tend to vote with Prince Sabahaddin's Liberty Party. Then, another one of our old friends, Armen Garo, leader of the Ottoman Bank takeover, was a deputy from Erzurum, representing the Armenian community in eastern Anatolia. Armen Garo was a longtime Dashnak who would at first, like the other Dashnaks, vote with the CUP on most issues and would declare a commitment to upholding the territorial integrity of the empire and to standing against separatism. 10 years later, in the aftermath of World War I and the catastrophe of the Armenian genocide, Armen Garo would help found the First Armenian Republic and would serve in the critical position of ambassador to the United States, who was a key patron for the young Armenian nation-state. And then, perhaps the greatest number of these national leaders would hail from the Arab world. Now, we will get to all of this later, but nearly all of the future Arab states would technically be protectorates under the patronage of either Great Britain or France. But these protectorates in the Middle East, specifically Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Transjordan, would count many former Ottoman leaders among their founding fathers, whether they be parliamentary delegates or former officers in the Ottoman army. The two most famous of the parliamentary delegates were the father-son duo from the Islamic Holy Lands of the Hejaz, Sharif Hussein and his son Sharif Abdullah. Both of these men were very important religious and political leaders in the Islamic world as the stewards of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and both Hussein and Abdullah would go on to play critical roles in the Arab Revolt against Ottoman rule during World War I and made famous later on by Lawrence of Arabia. But in 1908, both Hussein and Abdullah served as members in the Ottoman parliament, and like most other Arab delegates, they were initially loyal deputies committed to Ottomanism. But in just a few years' time, Sharif Hussein would declare the independent kingdom of the Hejaz, and he would serve as king for several years, until the Saudis defeated him and absorbed the Hejaz into Saudi Arabia. Then, Hussein's son, Sharif Abdullah, who was also an Ottoman deputy in parliament, would himself be chosen as the leader of the British Protectorate of Transjordan, which would emerge as a de facto autonomous region. And once Jordan became fully independent, Abdullah would be the first king of Jordan. And to give you a sense of the through line of history moving from Ottoman times to modern Middle Eastern history, Abdullah would play a critical role in the Arab-Israeli conflict, as Abdullah would be one of the few Arab leaders who would attempt to establish somewhat cordial relations with the Zionist government in Israel. So, figures like Sharif Abdullah highlight the way in which the legacy of Ottoman politics would persist well into the 20th century and help define the shape of the modern Middle East. And then finally, there would also be a good number of Turkish deputies who would go on to help Mustafa Kemal Ataturk found the Turkish Republic following Ottoman collapse in World War I. Though not quite as many as you might think, as Ataturk would expel a lot of CUP deputies following the war. All right, so we could play this name-dropping game all day long, as other deputies would also go on to be important in the national movements in Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, Libya, and more. But the point I want to highlight here is that the inauguration of Ottoman Parliament in December of 1908 was a moment in which many of the greatest political minds and most important future leaders in the Balkans, Turkey, and especially the Middle East briefly came together to try and make constitutionalism and liberalism work in the Ottoman Empire. This early experiment in parliamentary government would act as a critical incubator of future politics and would heavily influence the shape of things to come in the post-Ottoman world, as deputies would learn from their experiences in the Ottoman parliament, with some continuing to embrace democratic pluralism and others deciding that democratic pluralism was clearly a utopian fantasy. The first major crack in the foundations of the new constitutional regime would form in early 1909 as opposition to the CUP began to grow. This opposition would come from a few different angles. First, the Liberty Party would put together a voting bloc in Parliament committed to a decentralized vision of Ottomanism, in which local provinces would be given relative autonomy within a federalized system. This went directly against the efforts of Unionists in the CUP trying to strengthen the empire through asserting more centralized control over local provinces. Then the other major opposition would come from the conservative and reactionary elements in the empire, mostly from Islamic fundamentalists opposed to the CUP's attempt to secularize the government. In the spring of 1909, these two oppositional forces would make a very uneasy and very temporary alliance, as progressive liberals and reactionary conservatives would, somewhat unexpectedly, come together to try and oust the CUP from power. But even though members of the Liberty Party would play a critical role in the counterrevolution, the forces of reaction and religious conservatism would be much more visible and would end up playing a much more decisive role in the course of events. So we are going to begin by discussing the reactionary turn in Istanbul in early 1909 that would culminate in the so-called 31 March incident. The man who would lie at the heart of this reactionary turn, and who would end up being one of the primary conspirators behind the counter-revolution, was a Naqshbandi sheikh by the name of Dervish Vahdeti. Okay, so a lot of unfamiliar words thrown at you in succession there. But what you need to know is that Vahdeti was a member of a Sufi mystic order known as the Naqshbandi. But due to his populist and inflammatory politics, Vahdeti had largely been pushed out of official Sufi circles. Essentially, Vahdeti was like a renegade Muslim preacher professing a populist form of Islamic fundamentalism. In early 1909, the renegade preacher Vahdeti would take advantage of the newly liberalized press, and he would start up a newspaper called Volkan, which means the volcano. At first, Vahdeti actually approached Sultan Abdulhamid himself to help fund his paper. But interestingly, the Sultan declined this offer. And though this can be partly attributed to the fact that Vahdeti was known to be a bit of a wild card, in general, the Sultan would not play a very active role in the counter-revolution. Instead, the Sultan would simply allow events to unfold, especially when these events began to look like they might work out in his favor. So maybe this episode should be called The Supporters of the Sultan Strike Back. But, that is not very catchy at all. So even though it might be a bit misleading, I am sticking with The Sultan Strikes Back. At first, Vahdeti's paper, Volcan, would offer token support of the new constitutional regime under the CUP, though it did so while also promoting Vahdeti's populist form of Islam. But then, in early March 1909, Vahdeti would help found an organization called the Muslim Union. The Muslim Union was self-consciously a religious political organization whose purpose was to defend Islam and to oppose the rising tide of irreligiousness. Essentially, the Muslim Union would push an aggressively reactionary agenda, and they began to heavily criticize the secularizing policies of the CUP and of Parliament. Dervish Vahdeti would turn his newspaper, Volcan, into the mouthpiece of the Muslim Union, and the rhetoric within Volcan would rapidly become more and more inflammatory. And in a lot of ways, this is the moment when conspiracy theories about the true identity of the CUP began to spread like wildfire, with one of the most common and persistent of these conspiracies being the anti-Semitic conspiracy that the CUP was actually being run by so-called secret Jews. Now, this idea of secret Jews running the CUP, of course, comes from the fact that the CUP had its origins in Salonika, which was a majority Jewish city, and which was dominated by the Dunme, who were Muslims, but who had converted from Judaism years ago, and who maintained many Jewish traditions. So it's one of those things where it is true that the CUP had strong Jewish elements, with important Jewish and Dunme members, such as Emmanuel Carasso and Mehmed Javid. This conspiracy that the CUP was a Masonic Jewish Dunme plot would have a surprising amount of staying power, and during World War I, the British essentially formulated their entire foreign policy towards the Ottoman Empire under the erroneous belief that the CUP was actually being driven by a secret cabal of Jewish Freemasons. But obviously, the CUP was not some Jewish Masonic plot, seeing as the vast majority of their members were Sunni Muslims, and most CUP members historically saw themselves as the protectors of Muslims against Christian revolutionaries in Macedonia. But Dervish Vahdeti and other reactionaries would play up these anti-Semitic conspiracies in the pages of Volcan, and Vahdeti would also go around Istanbul making fiery speeches in which he denounced the CUP's turn towards atheism. And since the CUP was one of the few political parties to enjoy actual multi-ethnic and multi-religious membership, Vahdeti would claim that the CUP was being driven by secret, ungodly, and non-Muslim forces. Vahdeti even began to call for the expulsion of non-Muslims from the government, specifically picking out people like the Dunme economist Mehmed Javid. And then Vahdeti would also begin to call for the reinstatement of Sharia, or Islamic religious law. Dervish Vahdeti would find a lot of supporters in the Ottoman capital of Istanbul, amongst segments of the population who feared the radical changes that the new revolutionary order purportedly represented. The most important of these groups surrounding Vahdeti's reactionary movement would be, number one, young religious students known as softas, together with younger members of the ulama, or the religious scholars. And then number two, disaffected soldiers who chafed under the new dominance of the more well-educated officers, who had risen to prominence due to their support of the CUP. Now, we touched upon this dynamic briefly during our episode on the Young Turk Revolution, but to remind you, These highly educated officers were called the Mektebli officers, and they were potentially the most important base of support for the CUP. Some of the most famous members of the CUP, people like Ahmed Niazi, Ismail Enver, Ahmed Cemal, and Mustafa Kemal, were all Mektebli officers who had graduated from elite military schools. After the July Revolution, Mektebli officers became more powerful within the army, and there had been an ongoing process in which the younger Mektebli officers were replacing older and more experienced officers who lacked the same level of education as the Mektebli. These experienced officers who had attained their rank through years of loyalty and hard work were called the Alayla officers. And so Mektebli officers began to replace older Alayla officers. And then eventually the CUP did away with the system of rising through the ranks of the military entirely. The primary reason that the CUP cleaned house like this and changed the system of promotions is that the Mektebli officers tended to support the CUP, while the older and more experienced Alayla officers tended to remain loyal to the Sultan. This dynamic obviously created a lot of friction within the ranks of the military, but this friction would become most pronounced within the First Army stationed in Istanbul. For the most part, the loyal Alayla officers were generally stationed in the First Army in Istanbul and had enjoyed many perks and privileges due to their loyalty to Sultan Abdülhamid. And these older Alayla officers tended to be pretty lax with their soldiers, and they did not enforce much discipline. But the young Mektebli officers had all attended the elite military academies where German army officers had been brought in to train these future leaders of the Ottoman army. So when the Mektebli officers took over, they got a little too excited about implementing all of the new Prussian methods that they had learned about in school. And well, as you can probably guess, when these rank-and-file soldiers woke up one day and found that a bunch of pretentious young officers were now telling them to get up earlier and to drill later and to work harder, these rank-and-file soldiers in Istanbul began to get a bit restless. And then the real kicker came when the Mektebli officers abolished the traditional pauses to military training set aside for the daily Islamic prayers. Now, the Mektebli officers tended to be quite secular, so for them, this abolition of breaks for the call to prayer was seen as a progressive step forwards. But for the less educated rank-and-file soldiers who tended to be conservative and pious, this abolition of breaks for prayer was majorly offensive. And so, in this way, the soldiers in the First Army were increasingly drawn towards reactionary voices like Vadetti, who were railing against the alleged atheism of the CUP. So, this is the first avenue from which the counter-revolution would come. From rank-and-file soldiers in the First Army fed up with the CUP's secularization of the army and implementation of austere Prussian drilling. The resentment of these rank-and-file soldiers would then combine with the increasing resentment amongst young Islamic religious scholars and students, who saw the CUP as atheist and as secretly Jewish. These resentments would find their clearest expression in the pages of Volkan and in the fiery speeches of Dervish Vadetti, who would begin to gain an alarming number of followers in the army and in the religious schools going into the spring of 1909. Even though the rank-and-file soldiers of the First Army and the Softa religious students would be the ones to actually visibly carry out the insurrection in Istanbul, a lot of evidence actually points to the Liberty Party as the initial instigators of the social unrest that would culminate in the 31 March incident. In recent months, the Liberty Party, under the leadership of Prince Sabahaddin, had begun to recover from their poor performance in the parliamentary elections. It had gained a lot of support in parliament amongst independents and amongst local governors out in the provinces of the empire. As we have said, this increasing popularity of the Liberty Party stemmed from their platform of decentralization and local autonomy. Basically, as the CUP began to assert more centralized control over local communities, especially non-Turkish speaking communities, the CUP lost some of its initial allure. And this goes back to the classic divide over how to define Ottomanism. For the CUP, Ottomanism meant placing less emphasis on ethnic identities, as everyone was supposed to embrace one single Ottoman identity in place of all other identities, be they Albanian, Armenian, Greek, Kurdish, etc. But as press censorship was lifted and as free association was implemented, an increasing number of people from these different communities took advantage of these new freedoms to establish newspapers, journals, political parties, and clubs that would represent the interests of local ethnic and linguistic groups. So, much to the frustration of the Unionists in the CUP, one of the side effects of the July 1908 revolution was that there was a marked increase in ethnic nationalism. And critically, this would begin to include Muslim communities like Albanians, Kurds, and Arabs. Now, this was a gradual process, and ethnic nationalism amongst Muslims wouldn't really take off until after the counterrevolution. But the seeds were being planted, and ethnic communities were becoming frustrated with the centralizing policies of the CUP. These frustrations with CUP centralization would make Sabahaddin's Liberty Party generally more popular. So, going into the spring of 1909, there would be a lot of tension building within the capital, with increasing resentment against the CUP's political dominance. This would all coalesce around, first, the growing discontent within the ranks of the First Army and amongst religious students, and then second, amongst liberals and leaders of ethnic communities frustrated with CUP centralization. And with this cauldron of tension bubbling in the capital, all that was now needed was a spark. That spark would be lit on April 6, 1909, when a liberal journalist by the name of Hasan Fehmi was assassinated on the Galata Bridge, just down the street from the Imperial Ottoman Bank and right in the heart of Istanbul. Hasan Fehmi was a well-known journalist, and following the revolution, Fehmi had emerged as one of the fiercest critics of the CUP. So when Fehmi was assassinated, everyone assumed that he had been killed by a CUP agent. And even though the case lacked conclusive evidence and the true perpetrator was never identified, it is not that hard to understand why people would jump to the conclusion that this had been the work of the CUP. Because not only was Hasan Fehmi a prominent critic of CUP policies, but the CUP was also notorious for their assassinations of political rivals. Remember, the mutiny in the Third Army amidst the Young Turk Revolution had been accompanied by a widespread assassination campaign of Hamidian public officials. So one of the most powerful weapons wielded by the CUP had become their large network of self-sacrificing fedai, who were willing to put their own lives on the line in order to further the Unionist cause. These fedai volunteers had become quite good at assassinating the enemies of the CUP. So most people at the time, and most historians today, assume that it was a Unionist fedai who killed Hasan Fehmi. The assassination of Hasan Fehmi would plunge Istanbul into a state of anarchy and mass chaos. The funeral procession for the young journalist would be attended by more than 50,000 people in the imperial capital. And since Fehmi was most well known for his opposition to the CUP, this funeral procession quickly turned into a mass anti-government demonstration against the CUP, as a very diverse group of people representing a real hodgepodge of ideologies came together to oppose the Unionists, with liberals opposed to the CUP's creeping authoritarianism, Islamic students opposed to the CUP's alleged atheism, rank-and-file soldiers opposed to the CUP's strict military reforms, and ethnic minorities opposed to the CUP's centralization of government. This mass demonstration would create great unrest in the capital, and it would prime the forces of counter-revolution. And indeed, just a few days later, on the night of April the 12th, 1908, an armed insurrection broke out in the imperial capital. This insurrection was initiated by rank-and-file soldiers in the First Army, who mutinied at their barracks in the center of Istanbul, then proceeded to lock up their officers, and finally began marching in the streets, armed to the teeth. The soldiers would then be accompanied by Softa religious students, and this large and angry group processed to Parliament, where they menacingly encircled the building. The following morning, these demonstrators would be joined by an increasing number of troops, as well as members of the ulama religious scholars. Since the vast majority of these demonstrators were soldiers in the First Army, the government had no loyal troops whatsoever to break up this crowd. And so the chief of police was dispatched to nervously listen to the demands of these protesters. The demands were as follows. Number 1, the dismissal of the Grand Vizier Hussein Hilmi, who was largely aligned with the CUP, as well as the dismissal of a large number of CUP Mektebli officers. The crowd then also ordered the dismissal of a number of CUP deputies in Parliament and called for the replacement of Ahmed Reza as President of Parliament. In this last request, the crowd also called for Ahmed Reza to be presented to the crowd, with the assumption being that the demonstrators would lynch the positivist and anti-imperialist scholar for his alleged atheism. And then finally, the demonstrators also called for the full restoration of Sharia Islamic law. In the midst of this chaos, members of the CUP began to be targeted by the insurrectionaries, and at least 20 unionists were lynched by the crowd, with one poor soul being killed because he was mistakenly thought to be Ahmed Reza. However, the most powerful leaders of the CUP would manage to escape the violence as they found refuge in the houses of allies and friends in the imperial capital. And one of the most striking moments in this entire saga occurred when Mehmed Talat, leader of the CUP's Sacred Committee and future architect of the Armenian Genocide, found refuge with the prominent journalist and leader of the Armenian Dashnak Party, a man named E. Akuni. Akuni had long been one of the most outspoken supporters arguing for Armenian revolutionaries to form an alliance with the CUP in an effort to bring about a more inclusive and prosperous future for all Ottomans, no matter their race or religion. 7 years later, Akuni would be one of the very first victims in the Armenian Genocide, as Talat, Akuni's former friend and comrade, ordered the arrest of the most prominent Armenian intellectuals living in the capital. Since the government currently had no troops at their disposal, the administration had no choice but to accede to all of the protesters' demands. So, Hussein Hilmi resigned as Grand Vizier, and when the new cabinet was installed, they praised the mutinous soldiers and reactionary religious students and assured them that Sharia law would remain in force. And this is an interesting point to linger on for just a second longer, because a primary demand of the protesters had been the reinstatement of Sharia law. But technically speaking, Sharia law had never been abolished. Now, during the reforms of the Tanzimat era, secular law had been introduced on a wide scale, but it had been integrated with Sharia law. And one of the primary aims of a ton of the Tanzimat reformers had always been the project of modernizing and updating Islamic law, not in order to get rid of it, but in order to save it. This goes back to the larger project of Islamic modernism, which we covered in episode 2.14. For decades now, progressive members of the ulama religious scholars had been trying to reopen the so-called Gate of Ijtihad, or in other words, to reopen rational debate and to begin to question the traditional applications of Islamic Sharia law. So when these demonstrators demanded the reinstatement of Sharia law, they were referring to a very specific and very reactionary version of Sharia law. And yet again, a key issue here was the visibility of women and the introduction of women into the public sphere. Because leading up to this insurrection, Ottoman feminists had begun to gain some serious momentum, and female intellectuals became much more outspoken in their demands for full equality and for the full civic participation of women. Feminism had long been a key issue for Islamic modernizers of all shapes and sizes. These Islamic modernizers ranged from being secularized members of the CUP, hoping to modernize their empire in a way that stayed true to the Islamic character of the Ottoman fatherland, all the way over to reform-minded scholars amongst the ulama, or Islamic religious scholars. So what this means is that this is not as simple as unionists pushing for purely secular law versus reactionary religious scholars pushing for strict adherence to traditional Islamic norms. There were still members of the ulama and softa religious students pushing for a modernized version of Sharia law, in which, for example, women would be given increased rights and allowed to enter the public sphere. But what the 31 March incident would do is sharpen the dividing line between secularists and Islamic fundamentalists. And in the months and years and decades following the counterrevolution, the Unionists in the CUP and then the Kemalists in the Turkish Republic would become obsessed with reactionaries, who they saw as one of the primary enemies of their project to modernize their nation. Similarly, Islamic fundamentalists would begin to view secularists like the CUP and later Mustafa Kemal Ataturk as one of their primary enemies, and as the reason why Islamic society had decayed into sin and irreligiousness. Moving forward, these Islamic fundamentalists would begin to join up with the budding movement of Islamism that was just now beginning to coalesce right at this very same moment. And the man who is often pointed to as the father of Islamism is Rashid Rida. And Rashid Rida was carefully watching the events of spring 1909 unfold from the safety of Cairo. And tellingly, Rashid Rida at first supported the CUP, and his initial reaction to the counter-revolution was to turn against Sultan Abdul Hamid, whom he believed, erroneously, had unleashed chaos in the imperial capital. But as the coming months and years rolled by, and as the CUP became more secular, more centralizing, and more Turkish, Rashid Rida would, along with many other pious Arabs, turn his back on the CUP and begin to view them with disdain as heretics who were trying to westernize Islamic government. Rashid Rida's brand of Islamic revivalism mixed with anti-Western politics would form the nucleus of the emergent Islamist movement that would go on to be a super-duper big deal in driving Middle Eastern politics throughout the 20th century. But what Rashid Rida's initial support for the modernizers in the CUP demonstrates is how Islamism as a project had its roots in Islamic modernism. This is very often misunderstood by Western observers in particular. Rashid Rida, father of Islamism, was a former disciple of Muhammad Abduh. Muhammad Abduh was the most prominent Islamic modernist, and many viewed Rashid Rida as the successor to Muhammad Abduh. Now, I am oversimplifying a bit here, but what I want to get across is that Islamism began as a modernist project. But Islamism would then change in character, largely through the influence of Rashid Rida, to become more fundamentalist, more conservative, and more centered on Islamic revival instead of Islamic modernization. This shift would come about in direct response to, number one, secular nationalism, which the CUP was currently at the vanguard of within the Islamic world. And number 2, Western imperial domination, which will become more and more pronounced in the coming decades. In many ways, the counter-revolution during the 31 March incident was the symbolic moment in which the larger project of Islamic modernism that had defined progressive Ottoman politics for decades split in two, with one branch becoming committed to secularization and westernization, and with the other branch becoming committed to Islamic fundamentalism and anti-westernization. This division would take some time to fully form, but the seeds of this split between secular nationalism and Islamism, a divide that would define politics in the Islamic world going up to the present day, were first planted during the counter-revolution of 1909 in Istanbul. Now, as you can probably guess, the CUP was not about to take this reinstatement of Hamidian despotism lying down. And as we will see next episode, the CUP would quickly summon their forces, which would, of course, come from the Ottoman Balkans in Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, and Thrace. And under the leadership of General Mahmud Şevket Pasha, a massive multi-ethnic army would march towards the imperial capital in Istanbul, with the goal of reinstating the constitution and of getting rid of Sultan Abdülhamid once and for all. So, join me next episode as Mahmud Şevket leads the Action Army.